So last class I talked about, here are some things to consider when you are developing a scale or developing some questions. And the next 2 or 3 slides are just going to cover a couple more things. So when you're designing a survey or a scale, let's say you're measuring depression, you always want to go from general, so these open-ended questions, remember we talked about open-ended questions, to specific or our fixed alternative and rating scale questions. And there's an important reason for this. So let's pretend that we're assessing depression. And typically to assess depression, you ask, a bunch of questions about depression, right? About a bunch of depressive symptoms, whether you're experiencing them or not. And then let's say at the very end of that depression scale, you ask a big open-ended question, like, how are you feeling? Like, how do you feel? Some general open-ended question. Well, if we ask it at the end of at the end of that scale of all those depression fixed alternative questions, we may be putting thoughts into our participants' heads, because the whole point of an open-ended question is to hear what our participants are thinking and feeling, just unfiltered, just what's going on in their head. But if we ask that open-ended question after asking them a bunch of questions about depression, we may have primed them, or we may have put ideas into their head. So we always want to start with that open-ended question first. Additionally, we want to use our scales consistently. So if you remember last class, we talked about having scales that go from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So let's pretend that we have 5 or 6 questions. You want to make sure that all of those questions are on that same scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree. You don't want to have one question on that agree disagree scale, and then question number 2 on a satisfied to not satisfied scale. Then question number 3 jumps back to agree versus disagree. So you want to make sure all the questions in a chunk are the same, or on the same scale. Here are some other considerations. So remember that a lot of psychological self-reports are something that's called a retrospective report, or we're asking people about events, behaviors, and feelings from the past. And so there may be some problems with this. So if I were to ask you, what was your mood this morning when you first woke up? Most of you would probably be able to answer that without too much trouble. But if I were to ask you, what was your mood, or what feelings did you have on your first day of freshman year, most of you are probably going to struggle remembering that far back. But even if you can remember, it might not be what actually happened. So responses may be based on false memories. And we all, hopefully you've heard about false memories in some of your other classes. I'm not going to go into it today, but retrospective reporting, or reporting on your past, may be influenced by some false memories. And just because a participant is confident in their memory, it doesn't mean it's going to be accurate. So that's something you have to look out for if your study is doing a retrospective report. And then finally, here's some other considerations, and some that you're going to actually be doing for your own study, is you're always going to want to write a bigger pool of questions than you need. So all of you in your groups are going to have to come up with 5 to 7 questions regarding social media, exercise, or body image. But I'm going to advise that you actually come up with like 10 or 12. That way you can whittle them down into the best ones. You're going to want to revise your questions and think carefully about if you're asking any biased questions or questions that aren't clear. And then typically most researchers, or all researchers, if you're developing a scale, have to do some sort of pretest. And you guys are going to do that by asking your own group members, so within your own group, and then I'll also look at your scale. But typically you want a subset of a population to take that survey and to then interview them about the questions. So be like, were the questions clear? Did they make sense? Blah, 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 blah. There's a bunch of stuff that you can look into. But always write, revise, and pretest your questions. So I finally want to end talking about self-reports, about some advantages and disadvantages of self-reports. So advantages. It's relatively inexpensive and a very efficient way to collect your data. So one of the things that you're going to have to do is we're going to put it in, or I'm going to put your questions into Qualtrics, and then you're going to put it on social media, a link on your social media, and be like, hey, can you guys please take, can your followers, friends, and family please take this survey? And what you'll see is we have 25 students in this class. We can probably get 200 to 300 participants in a couple of days. So it can be very fast and also very inexpensive compared to some other measures like behavioral measures, which we'll get into today. Another advantage of self-report is that it allows us to measure thoughts, opinions, or experiences that may not be reflected in behavior. Once again, how do you measure self-esteem, right? How do you directly observe self-esteem? Well, you really can't. You have to use self-report. And so self-reports may be the only way to do that. However, there are disadvantages of self-report. People can lie, right? Whether they are intending to lie because they want to be seen as desirable, so that social desirability effect, or maybe they're just misremembering, right? Because of those retrospective reports. So people are oftentimes not truthful. Sometimes people often lack insight into their inner lives. So if you think back to, or not think back to, but think about everyone's view of themselves may be biased, right? How you view yourself may not be how others view you, and it may not be necessarily accurate because you're a little bit biased. So that's another disadvantage of self-reporting. And then if your questions aren't clear, or if they're biased, writing clear, unbiased questions can be challenging. And this is something that you're going to have to do next week. And I think you're going to see it's not as easy as you might think. Writing good questions can be difficult. All right, before we jump into behavioral measures, does anyone have any questions about these past few slides or self-reports in general? I have a question in chat about the study that you're going to be doing. It says, is there a minimum number of people that we need to get responses from? I'm assuming you're referring to your study for your groups. So what's going to end up happening is I'm going to combine groups into 2 surveys. So I'm going to put like 3 groups into 1 survey. And then you're going to put that link out to your friends and family. I advise on social media. So there's no minimum, and I have no way of knowing if you actually do that, like if you actually put the link on your social media. I'm just going to trust that you're going to do it so that way we get participants. But what's going to end up happening is participants are going to then click on that link and take a survey that takes like 5 minutes. It really shouldn't take that long for your participants to do. And then hopefully we should be able to get like, anywhere from 100 to 200 or more participants for your survey. But there's not a minimum because I can't enforce a minimum, but we're going to get a lot just of the nature of putting it on social media. And I've done this before in other, like last semester, there were groups of 5 and participants only took 1 survey. And within 2 or 3 days, each group was getting like 150 participants. So don't worry about getting the number of participants you need. All right, so I'm moving on. Let's move on to behavioral measures. So these are pretty self-explanatory, right? These measures involve behaviors that you can see, hear, or otherwise detect or observe. So examples of these behaviors include, let's say, kicking or hitting, like in that video I had you watch. Perhaps you want to see how often someone smokes or drinks. Maybe I want to assess addiction to your phone and count how many times you pick up your phone in an hour. Or you could count, how many words someone speaks. So these are all examples of observable behaviors, and that's what behavioral measures look to assess. So here's some general considerations to consider about behavioral measures. Like any type of measure, you need to have a very clear operational definition. And hopefully this will become apparent when I ask you how many aggressive acts you observed in a few slides. But we need to clearly define what behavior we're measuring. Because, for example, what is an aggressive act, right? I didn't give you any definition of what an aggressive act is. So I guarantee you later on, when I ask you how many aggressive acts you observed, I'm going to get a wide range because it can vary. So you need to be very clear in what you're measuring. And there's some different ways you can do measuring. You can do behavioral measurements. You can do direct observation. So I can sit there and, sit in a playground and watch a participant, or let's say I'm a behavioral therapist. I can watch a kid in a playground. I could perhaps record people and review those recordings at a later date. There's electronic means. So let's say I wanted to see what exactly you're looking at on social media. I could hook you up to an eye tracker and see exactly what you're staring at on your phone. So you could have that exact measurement of what people are looking at. That's their behavior. So your goal is to make observations as objective as possible. This is kind of just like self-reports. You want to have as objective of a measure as possible. But I think you'll see as the slides go on, it can be a little bit more difficult in these behavioral measures. So we're going to jump into types of behavioral measures. And the first one we're going to start off with is this idea of a qualitative narrative. So this is a full description of participant behavior over the entire observation period. Your goal is to capture everything about an interaction. So think about if you were that super nanny in that video I had you watch. If the super nanny wanted to do a qualitative narrative, she just would have sat in a corner and would just write down everything that she saw in that half hour, however long that she was there. She would just sit there and write everything down. So it can be written, you can have like open-ended, unstructured, or you can record it and then write down stuff later. However, there's a big limitation to there's a couple limitations to these qualitative narratives compared to some of the other behavioral measures we'll get into. First off, it can take a long time to collect data. So if you can think about if you were that nanny in that video, it would take you a long time to sit there for just one kid to sit there and observe for half an hour and write everything down, or maybe record it and have to write stuff down and pause the video. It takes a long time to do that. The data is difficult to summarize because you're just writing down what you see. So you're going to then have to go later and figure out like, okay, well, what exactly did you see? What am I measuring? You have to go back and then look at all these notes that you took. And then finally, the behavioral descriptions may be subjective rather than objective. So if we had that super nanny sit in the corner and write stuff down, and then I were to go in and see that same exact thing and sit down and write down, we may see two different things or be focused on two different things, or we could miss things. Like I could miss something that she caught and maybe she missed something that I caught. So qualitative narratives do come with a lot of limitations. So let's get slightly better. Another type of behavioral measure is categorization. So this is where before the researcher goes in to observe behavior, we come up with predetermined categories. So let's think about aggression. Let's say I was at Super Nanny and I was going in to view those kids. Maybe I could have a checklist of these three things: hitting, kicking, and yelling. And every time I saw one of those behaviors, I put a check mark or a tally in that box. So then I could have, I had these predetermined categories and I could just check off every time I see it. But there's a problem with this because it may be difficult to predict all appropriate categories, right? What happens if I see someone pulling hair? Well, where does pulling hair fall in that hitting, kicking, and yelling? Okay, it doesn't. So now I need to create something on the spot. How about throwing something? Throwing something doesn't fall into these categories. And so a lot of times what you'll see is unless you have 10, 15, 20 years of experience, measuring aggressive kids, you may not be able to know everything beforehand before you go in. So categorization comes with that problem of it's difficult to predict what's going to happen. Another type of behavioral measure is you could count the number of behaviors that occur. So some examples are number of words recalled, right? If you're assessing memory, how many math problems you get in 2 minutes, the number of aggressive acts. So in the chat using a direct message, just send me how many number of aggressive acts you counted in that 1 minute span. All right. So I'm seeing, like I thought, a relatively wide range of numbers, and it looks like it's ranging anywhere from 15 to 30. And this is a result of a couple different problems. First off, I never defined what an aggressive act is, right? There are many different types of aggressive acts. Me personally, I counted 26. But you need to come in with predefined, really strict definitions. So, for example, I think that at one point there was one of the little boys hit the other brother like 3 times in a row. Does that count as 3 different aggressive acts, or does that count as one? Right? What happens if you're observing a kid and they throw something at another kid, but they miss? Does that count as an aggressive act? Do you need to actually be aggressive to, or do you actually need to physically hit or hurt someone for it to be aggressive? What happens if I throw something, but I didn't intend to hit anybody, but I accidentally hit my brother in the head with a baseball, but I didn't mean it? Is that an aggressive act? Probably not, but if you're an outside observer, it may look like an aggressive act. So you need to have really strict definitions for behaviors. One way to get around that, one way to get around this number of behaviors and this problem with it is to do something that's called an interval measure. So this is where you count the number of time intervals during which a behavior occurs. And let me give you an example. Let's pretend you're that super nanny and you say, I'm going to watch these kids for 10 minutes. And you're going to break up that 10 minutes into 30-second chunks. So you'll end up having 20 observation time intervals. And what you'll do is, okay, for the first 30 seconds, did my participant act aggressive? Okay, they did. Doesn't matter if they did it 10 times or if they only did it once, they still get a check mark for that 30 seconds. Now I do the next 30 seconds. Did they act aggressive? Okay, they did, check mark. The next 30 seconds. No, they didn't. Okay, no check mark. So you can see if you're doing 10 minutes and 30-second intervals, and potentially there's opportunities for that kid to act aggressively 20 times because of those intervals. And now you may be like, well, that doesn't tell us like intensity or anything like that. True, but over the course of, let's say, several months, if you're a behavioral therapist, it's a good way to measure, okay, and the first time that I saw this kid, he acted aggressive every single time, every single interval. But maybe several months later, he only acted aggressive once out of that, in his entire 10 minutes. So it's just an easier way to break down how many times a participant engages in a behavior based on time. Another type of behavioral measure is timing. There's a lot here, and I'm going to go over it quickly because I think they're relatively straightforward. So you can measure reaction time, how quick someone responds to a stimulus. You can measure how long it takes them to finish a behavior. You can measure how long that behavior lasts. You can measure the time between 2 behaviors. So let's say you wanted to measure smoking. And how often someone smokes. And so you can imagine that if you were doing some type of quitting smoking, program, that at the beginning of the program, the time between smoking might be half an hour or might be 20 minutes. And at the end of the program, the time between smoking might be several hours. So you can see some differences there. Anyways, I think these are pretty straightforward when it comes to timing. Timing behavioral measures are commonly used as a dependent measure in cognitive psychology, just as an aside, as a fun fact. I should mention, on a test, I will never have you define these. So like if you haven't gotten a chance to write all these down in the definition, don't worry, because I think a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory by the title. What would end up happening is I'd give you an example and then be like, is it reaction time, task completion, duration? So like you won't never have to remember all four of these. I'll give them to you. And I think the definition is pretty self-explanatory by the name of it. So don't worry if you haven't written down the definition of these. Oh, and then finally, the last type that we're going to go over is you could use a rating scale for behavior. This is typically done if you're trying to assess the quality or the intensity of that behavior. So for example, did the child cry when the parent left the room? On a scale, I think it's on a scale of like, let's say 1 to 7, from 1, not at all, to 7, extremely. So really intense, whatever behavior that you're measuring. So you can use rating scales as well when measuring behaviors. Does anyone have any questions regarding any of the types of behavioral measures? Okay. So let's jump into some advantages and disadvantages of behavioral measures. The advantage is you're relying on observation of behavior or something that isn't conceptual. So something like self-esteem, right? You have to use those self-reports and it isn't concrete. Well, now we're actually measuring behavior and this is concrete. And so this is the cornerstone of empiricism or or research, right? Observing or measuring concrete behavior. So it is an advantage of behavioral measures. One disadvantage is it's often difficult to ensure consistency and objectivity. So let's say in a typical study of behavior, right? What ends up happening is, let's say we record an interaction between, I'm not super nanny, right? And in an actual psychological research study, unless you're doing like real hardcore behaviorist research where you like are focusing on one kid only, if you have a lot of participants, what ends up happening is you have a research team and you'll have like 2 or 3 people look at a video separately, independently of each other, and they'll count how many aggressive acts that they saw. And then what we do is we come together and we look at how reliable we are. So let's say I counted 26, Patrick counted 25, and Seneca counted 24. So that would be pretty reliable. However, if we didn't really define what we were measuring, Patrick may have said 16, I said 40, and Seneca said 30, right? Then there'd be a lot of variability, and that's not good. So that's really, that can occur if you don't have really strict definitions of what you're measuring. There might be one more. Yeah, okay. So another disadvantage of behavioral research is that the research situation may alter behavior. So people react differently if they know they're being observed, right? If you're trying to observe how a mom treats a kid, if of course the mom's going to act different if she knows she's being observed. And I just picked that example, but it happens all the time in any type of research that you can imagine. People act differently if they know they're being watched. There may be some ethical issues because you want to make sure that the participants, there's privacy issues, there may be privacy issues, and they are typically very expensive and time consuming. So if you imagine that super nanny, has to sit there and watch for half an hour, right? And that's just one participant. Imagine if you were doing an actual research study and you needed to watch 100 participants. It would take you so long to do. So measuring behaviors can take a while and they may be expensive. All right, are there any questions about behavioral measures? All right. So we're not going to go into physiological measures in class today. Just note that there is a mini lecture, 5-ish minutes on eCampus. Make sure you watch that after class or at some point before you take the next quiz or exam, because it will be on the quiz or exam. But just know there is a video on physiological measures on eCampus. All right, so we're going to switch gears slightly, and let's focus on how do we know if we have a good measure. There's multiple different ways that you can do that, but today, hopefully we get it finished, we're going to focus on scale of measurement, reliability, and validity. So let's jump into scale of measurement. And by scale of measurement, I'm referring to nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio scales. Has anyone in your previous classes ever come into the definitions or examples of nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio scales? Just put like your hand up in chat if you have. I'm assuming most people haven't. Yeah, so I don't see any hands going up. So this is all new. I'm going to say, because I was once a student in your shoes many years ago, that this is going to be a little difficult. However, I want you to pay attention to the examples I give. And if you're confused by the definitions, I want you to pay attention to the examples, because I think the examples are much more useful than some of the definitions. So in psychological research, we can measure things using a nominal scale. And I also suggest there are a lot of good resources online. If you type in like examples of a nominal scale on Google, like examples of nominal scale psychology, you'll come up with a lot of examples for each of these. So if what I say doesn't make sense, and you can just Google search this and you'll come in with a lot of good examples. Anyways, I'm going to start off with an example of nominal scale. So I'm going to work from the bottom and then go up. So an example of a nominal scale is, what is your favorite soda? You can choose between 1 is Pepsi, 2 is Coke, 3 is Mountain Dew, and 4 is other. Another example of a nominal scale is, what's your gender? Male, female, other. So then let's jump all the way up to that first bullet point is, the key requirement of a nominal scale is that the data, the categories that you can choose from are mutually exclusive and they are exhaustive. So what does that mean? Mutually exclusive means if I'm a participant, I can only choose one, right? What is your favorite soda? I can only choose Pepsi. I can only choose between one of those options. You can only have one favorite, right? It can only be Pepsi, it can only be Coke, it can only be Mountain Dew, or it can be other, right? Because maybe it's Dr. Pepper, you would choose other. And it must be exhaustive in that every participant should be able to choose an option. So let's think about that gender one, right? Let's say my options were just male and female. When we're talking about gender, it can be other, right? So if you didn't have that other, let's say if someone was not a male or a female, they didn't identify as a male or a female, they wouldn't be able to choose. Let's say, think about the soda example. This one may be a little bit, if we got rid of that 4, other, what if your favorite soda was Dr. Pepper? Well, you wouldn't be able to choose between Pepsi, Coke, or Mountain Dew. If you could choose, which one do you like more, but that's not the question. It's what's your favorite soda. So once again, stepping back, you can only choose one, or a participant can only choose one, and an option there has to be available for every participant. I have here, if numbers appear, they only indicate category membership. And this is in reference to some of the other ones that are coming up in the next slide or two. It doesn't matter here what we put as a 1 or a 2. Like I could have female be a 1 and male be a 2. It doesn't matter. The numbers don't matter. However, you're going to notice whenever we start getting into analyzing data, like on SPSS, everything needs a number. That's how like analyses are done. So you have to assign numbers to categories, but in nominal scales, it doesn't matter what number you assign to which category. And I think this will make more sense in the next one, but Seneca, go ahead, you can ask your question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, this might be a stupid question, but why use numbers instead of, I mean, it's basically like having A, B, C, D. So why have numbers instead of, like, would they add up later or anything like that and like correspond to a certain category, or do they just have numbers because they have numbers?
No, so that's a really good question, and this will make more sense whenever we start doing data analysis. So in SPSS and in any statistical software package you use, you have to assign numbers to things, just because that's just how the programs work. In theory, no, you could have A, B, C, but in actual, whenever you do data analysis, there has to be numbers.
Okay.
The numbers don't mean anything, but there
Mhm.
has to be numbers whenever you do data analysis.
Okay. Thank you.
And so you can see here that, like I said, it doesn't matter what number you assign. I mean, you could assign. Let me go back. You could assign as A, B, C, and D. Like when I'm like like if you're taking a test, it could be A, B, C, D. But in research and data analysis, it has to be numbers in the stats programs. All right, let's move on to the next one. And one of the things you're going to notice is I'm doing these in a specific order. So we started off with, going back one, nominal. Now we're going to go to ordinal. Then I'm going to go to interval, and then I'm going to go to ratio. And what you're going to see is all these scales build upon one another. So in an ordinal scale, it has everything that a nominal scale has, but now we add something. Now we add that order matters. So let's go and look at some of these examples. If I asked you, how bored are you right now? And I gave you these categories, very bored, slightly interested, very interested. You can see that there's still categories, right? There's categories, but now the order matters. You can go from low to high. However, and this is a key point that distinguishes ordinal from the next one, the distance between the categories or ranks is unknown. So let me give you an example of, let me stick with this very bored, slightly bored example. If I were to choose, if Patrick was to choose very bored, but let me back up. Let me not say what you choose. What's the difference between very bored and slightly bored? Can you really say? Not really, right? There's an arbitrary difference. Is the difference between very bored and slightly bored the same as the difference between slightly bored and slightly interested? No, you can't really quantify it, right? It's just all arbitrary. Think about the difference, and let's be a little bit more concrete. So think about finishers in a foot race, right? You can have a first, you can have a second, and you can have a third. So there's an order to this. However, the difference between first and second might not be the same as the difference between second and third. So the difference between first and second might be, let's just say 10 seconds, but the difference between second and third is a minute. So the space between your options are not the same. Think about small, medium, and bored. I didn't mean to say bored. I meant to say big. Think about small, medium, and big. Let me go ahead and just fix that right now. Small, medium, and big. So if I were to give you an ant, a bicycle, and a skyscraper, right? Obviously the ant is small, the bicycle is medium, and the skyscraper is big. But is the difference between a bicycle and an ant the same as a bicycle and a skyscraper? No, but we can still put them in this order. So going back to this nominal scale, right? We have categories, but the order doesn't matter. Now we have categories, but now the order matters. However, the space between the categories is just arbitrary. So now let's go to an interval scale. Now, order still matters, so we still encompass everything from the prior two, but now the difference between the numbers are meaningful. So the difference between 2 and 1 is the same as the difference between 4 and 3, right? They're both 1. But here's the big thing that differentiates interval from the next one, ratio. And this will make more sense when we get into ratio. But the origin or 0 point of the scale is arbitrary, so the ratios are not meaningful. And let me explain what this means. So let's say we are measuring, this is essentially saying there is no true 0 point in these type of scales. So think about temperature. And let's stick with Fahrenheit because this doesn't work with Kelvin. It works with Fahrenheit and Celsius. So what does 0 mean? What does a 0 Fahrenheit mean? And this is a rhetorical question because I don't expect you to have a true answer to this, because a 0 is really arbitrary. A 0 doesn't mean the absence of temperature, right? And this is important because of the second point. The ratios are not meaningful. So this means that 20 degrees is not twice, or 40 degrees is not twice as hot as 20 degrees. But the difference between 40 degrees and 20 degrees is the same as the difference between 60 degrees and 40 degrees, right? So that difference is meaningful, but there is no true 0, and so therefore ratios aren't meaningful. Let's think of something like intelligence, like the SAT. Let's say I got a 400 on the SAT and Seneca got 800 on the SAT. Well, and then let's say someone else got a 400, 800. Yeah, so let's just stick with that. So you can't say that Seneca is twice as smart as me, right? Just because she scored double. If let's say we're equating SAT with intelligence, you can't say that. Just like you can't say 20 degrees is or 40 degrees is twice as hot as 20 degrees. But there is a meaningful difference between numbers. Let's think of something like a math test, right? If I got 20 points, if I got 20 points and someone got 22 points, and then someone got 40 points, like the difference between 22 and 20 is the same as the difference between 5 and 3. It's 2 points. But you can't say that someone is twice as smart as someone just because they scored double amount of points. This will make a little bit more sense when we go to the next one, ratio. And then I'm going to have a slide right after all these that shows you how they build upon each other. But let's go for something like a ratio scale. So a ratio scale is almost exactly like an interval scale, except the 0 point on that scale indicates the absence of something. And now ratios can be meaningful. So think about something like line length, right? The difference between 2 inches and 1 inch is the same thing as the difference between 20 inches and 19 inches. It's 1 inch. Just like in a ratio, or just like in an interval scale, right? The difference between things are still, they're meaningful. But you can have a 0, right? Something can be 0 inches. It just doesn't exist, I guess. But now we can say 4 inches is twice as big as 2 inches. Let me do one where a 0, I mean, 0 still makes sense in this, but let me do one where 0 makes a little bit more sense. Think about number of behaviors. So let's say we're measuring smoking. You can have the absence of smoking, right? I don't smoke cigarettes, therefore I have a 0. A 0 is meaningful. Someone who smokes 10 cigarettes smokes twice as many as someone who only smokes 5 cigarettes. So that ratio is meaningful. All right, before I ask for questions, I want to show this slide. So this shows you how they build upon each other. Remember, nominal is just categories. Order doesn't matter, numbers don't matter. But in one step above that, we have ordinal. Now we still have categories, but order matters now. All right, let's jump one more to interval. Everything's still the same as the previous ones. However, now distance between numbers matter. Let's go one step further. Everything is still the same, but now we have a true 0. All right, so the remainder slides are going to be me asking you what you think certain examples are, whether it's nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. But before we get there, does anyone have any questions about the distinctions between these four? And if you're still slightly confused and not 100% sure you can identify them, let's just wait a couple of slides when I give you, when we show some examples. Because I really think examples are the best way to understand the differences between some of these. So let's first talk about why this is important very briefly. So the scale of measurement determines what statistics you can do. So if you ask something in a nominal way, you can't do, let's say, a correlation with that variable. But if you were to ask it in a ordinal, interval, or ratio, you could do a correlation. You couldn't do a t-test, and we'll get into what that means later, but you can't do a t-test with something like ratio, interval, or ordinal, but you can do a t-test on a variable like nominal. So it matters statistically which one you choose. But you also get different amounts of information depending on what you ask. And we want to collect as much data as possible. So let me show you what this means in terms of collecting as much information as possible. So here I have the question about smoking, but I'm going to ask it in 3 different ways. And each way is a different way of measurement. So we could ask it nominally, which remember is the lowest, and we get the least amount of information from this. Do you smoke? Yes or no? Remember, it's categories. The order doesn't matter. I could put no first, or assign a 2 to no and a 1 to yes, or a 1 to no and a 2 to yes. So it's nominal, right? Do you smoke? Yes, no. Well, we could go up a step and let's do some ordinal. Let's ask it in an ordinal way. How much do you smoke? And we give them options: never, seldom, lightly, moderately, heavily. And so now you see we have a low and we have a high, right? So that's what distinguishes it from nominal, because we have order to it. But the difference between never and seldom is not the same as the difference between moderately and heavily, right? It's not the same. So the distance between our options are not the same, which is why it's not an interval. But we still are getting more information than just asking yes or no. And then finally, we could ask it in a ratio way. How many cigarettes do you smoke in a typical day? And then we allow participants to, put anywhere from 0 to however many cigarettes they smoke. So do people, using this example, do you see how we can ask the same idea, like do you smoke, in multiple different ways? And why one way would be a nominal, another way would be ordinal, and another way would be ratio. And you can see that we would get more information, or it's more useful information from this ratio than this ordinal. And this ordinal is more information than this nominal. All right. So let's see. Yeah. So next up, just in direct message, let's do these one at a time. So don't be doing them all at once. So let's stick with the first question. What is your gender? Is it A, B, C, or D? Nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio? Okay, good. So I'm seeing a majority of A, and it is A. It's nominal. It's not, I've seen a couple people say it's ordinal. It's not ordinal because order doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if I put male first or female first, or if I put female first or male. It doesn't matter. We're just categorizing them. How about what is your age? Just an open-ended response. What is your age? All right, so I'm seeing some different answers here, and I'm seeing a bunch of wow, okay, so I'm seeing a wide range. So the true answer is it's D. It's a ratio, because you can have a zero, right? You can be zero. You cannot be born yet. You can be 0 years old, and the difference between 0 and 1 is the same as 99 and 89, right? It's 1 year. So right there, we know it's not nominal, because we know there's an order, right? You can have young to old. So order matters. So we know it's not nominal. And there is a true zero, because you can be 0 years old. And you can say someone is twice as old as someone else. So we know that ratio can matter. So it has to be, so it has to be ratio. How about what is your age range? So we have 1 to 18, 19 to 25, 26 to 49, and 50 plus. This one's tricky. This one's really tricky. All right. So I'm seeing a lot of people say C. And this would be something easy to a trap to fall into. The actual answer is B. It's ordinal. And here is why. So if I'm a participant and I say I choose option A, right, 1 through 18, you don't actually know how old the participant is. So the difference between, let's say this was A, B, C, and D, right? Those are your four options. The difference between A and B might not be the same difference as between C and D, because I could be 18 years old and someone could be 25. And so, what is that difference? That is 7, right? Or that participant could be 1 and another participant could be 25. So the difference between A and B could be like 24. So the differences may differ depending on the participant. So that is why it's ordinal. That one's a really tricky one. Do people understand why it's ordinal and not interval? It's not interval because you're not 100% sure of the distances between A and B, between those two categories. But I can perfectly understand why I believe everyone who responded, almost everyone who responded said C. You're not 100% sure of the differences between the two categories. All right, let's do some more. What is your current relationship status? Is it nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio? All right. What is your current relationship status? Is it nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio? I'd also suggest you don't listen to music that loud while you're watching these lectures. You probably aren't getting what I'm saying. All right, good. I'm seeing a majority A. It is nominal. Let's see. What do other people say? I'm seeing a couple C's. For the sake of time, I'm not going to ask people why they think it's C. If you have any questions, if you're unsure, just see me afterwards or like during my office hours. All right, next one. What level of satisfaction best describes your relationship status? From very dissatisfied to very satisfied. All right, I'm seeing a lot of B's, and that is the correct answer because it has an order, right, from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. So there is a logical order, but the difference between 1 and 2 might not be the same as the difference between 4 and 5. I do have to pause and say this gets a little bit weird. So if you're looking at one individual question on a scale, it would typically be ordinal like this. However, if I were to ask 5 questions about your relationship status and then like add them all together to get a scale from what would it be? If I had 5 questions, I could have a scale from 5 to 25, right? If I a minimum of 5 and a max of 5, then it would actually be interval. This is a really arbitrary point, and as I was watching Dr. Tenenholt's lecture, she really just brushes over it, doesn't even really, just brings it up, but doesn't explain why. So just know that if you're asking individual questions like these, majority of people are right. It is an ordinal scale. However, when you combine several questions into one scale, when like a scale 5 to 25, you add up all these questions, it becomes an interval scale because the differences between the numbers, it kind of becomes a little bit more solidified. Anyways, let's move on a little bit. I don't believe that comes up in the exam. So you don't have to know that, but just know in reality, I think it's an interval scale. If it does come up on the exam, I'm going to throw out that question. I should mention that I can see like how many people get questioned, like a certain question right or wrong. And if a majority of people get a question wrong, I'm the type of professor that just throws that question out. So like everyone gets those points. So yeah, just as a side note. All right, let's just do a couple more. What is your IQ? Is it nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio? All right, I'm seeing some varying answers, but the majority of people do have it right. So if we ask what is your IQ on a scale like this, where we just open-ended, allow you to put a number in, it is an interval. It's not a ratio because you can't have a 0 IQ. I guess you can if you're dead, but you can't have a 0 IQ. A 0 doesn't represent no intelligence, right? So you could, I think in theory, score 0 maybe on the IQ. I don't even know if you can. But if you could, let's say it's the non-traditional one, a 0 doesn't indicate that you have the absence of intelligence. It just means that you are maybe not as intelligent as other people. So that's why it's not ratio. And so it's interval because yes, the numbers are, the difference between 100 and 101 is the same as the difference between 103 and 104. All right, how about if we ask, what is your IQ range? What would that be? Think back to that age range question I asked a couple slides ago. All right, I'm seeing a lot of B's in chat, and that is right. It is ordinal. Remember, if someone had in this scale, if someone had a 72 and you were comparing it to someone in this group who had an 85, it would be different than if someone had a 73 comparing it to someone who had 115. So you just always got to think, is the difference between two participants who would fall in there, is it the same? So that's why that, yes, it is it's ordinal because there is an order to it, but you can't 100% for sure know the differences between categories. All right, I think there's 2 more. How many hours per week do you use a computer? Oh, is it interval? Yeah, just type in the chat, not A, B, C, or D, but is it interval, ratio, ordinal, or nominal? Seen a lot of ratios. It is a ratio because you can have a 0, right? I used a computer 0 hours per week. If there is a true zero, here's a good general rule. If there is a true zero, meaning there you can have the absence of whatever you're measuring, it's always going to be a ratio. If you can determine the difference, if you can determine if the difference between one category and another category is the same as another, like the difference between 1 and 2 is the same as 3 and 4, or the difference between A and B is the same as the difference between C and D, your options, then it can be, let me back up 1 second. Let me show you what I mean by that. Is there a good example here? Let me reword what I just said. I'm trying to come. Actually, I'll do it in an email. I'll send out an email after class sometime in the next day or two with some more general rules about trying to identify what is what. But yes, this would be a ratio because there is a true zero. You can have 0 hours a week per computer. All right, final question. Have you given up or reduced social, recreational, and or occupational activities in order to increase computer use? Is it nominal, interval, ratio, or ordinal? All right, good. I am seeing a lot of nominals, right? It's just yes and no. Any yes and no is going to be nominal. Yeah, like gender, male, female, other. It's always going to be nominal. If there's no order to it, if there's no order to your categories, it's always nominal. But yeah, be on the lookout. I'll send an email out with a little bit more, some general rules that you can apply. All right, cool. We're doing great on time. Does anyone have any questions about scale of measurement? I know they can be difficult. It is a difficult topic, and I remember having difficulty as an early psych student myself. I remember hating these and struggling with them. They can be difficult, but just know, let me go back to this slide, they all build off one another. So if you can know that, so know what defines each one. If there's a true zero, it has to be a ratio. If there's not a true zero, but you know that the distance between numbers matter, but there is no true zero, it has to be an interval. If you don't know the distance between numbers, but the order matters, right? You can have a low to a high, it's going to have to be an ordinal. And if order does not matter, it's always going to be nominal. So be on the lookout for an email from me. I will lay that out more in words about some more general rules. But I do understand that they can be difficult. But hopefully this slide can help with understanding what makes each one different. Yes, the hardest can be determining the difference between interval and ordinal. But hopefully by looking at examples of ordinal and interval, you can see that there are some clear distinctions. It's really coming down to understanding that the difference between the numbers are meaningful. Like the difference between very bored and slightly bored is kind of arbitrary, right? It's not the same as the difference between slightly interested and very interested. It could vary from person to person. Someone asked, is asking for age in an open-ended question is ratio because you can have someone who is 0? Yes, you can have someone who is 0. At any time you ask, yeah, because there is a true 0, right? 0 years old, and because, not and, as a result of that true 0, you can say something like, I can be twice as old as someone else. Because I'm 26 years old, I am twice as old as someone who's 13. But yeah, age as an open-ended is a ratio. All right, if you have any more questions about, well, literally anything, but about scales of measurement, please feel free to email me. So we're going to switch, and this is great, perfect amount of time. This is also really good because next Friday we'll have an optional class just because we got stuff done. We're going to switch gears and focus on reliability and validity. Now, I'm only going to touch on these big picture ideas. And there's also another 5-minute mini lecture that I want you to watch that talks about how we actually measure reliability and validity. I'm just going to touch on what they are. So because psychological measures are indirect, so let's think about self-reports, right? Some of the behavioral measures are direct, but let's think about self-report, which is the majority of psychological research. Because psychological measures are indirect, we're going to have to infer whatever we're measuring, like self-esteem, from behavior or self-reports. So this introduces the idea of measurement error. So for example, let's say we're measuring intelligence with just a standard IQ test. Here are some sources of error. So what I really want you to know here are these 4 different types of error and some examples of each. So let's think about transient participant factors, or I'm going to call them like, well, yeah, transient participant factors. So these are things that are not, my definition is going to be, it's not stable, but things are like mood, hunger, or fatigue. So let's say you were taking a test, right? An IQ test, it doesn't matter, any test, but we'll stick with intelligence. You were taking a test and you come in angry. You're probably not going to do as well as if you came in and you were happy. Or let's say you were hungry, right? You're probably not going to perform as well on an IQ test if you're hungry or if you're tired. So transient participant factors are things that can influence your score on an intelligence test that are not related to intelligence. Actually, all of these things are things that can influence your score that aren't related to the thing that you're actually measuring. So then you can have things like stable participant attributes. So these are things like your motivation. So if someone is a motivated person, they're probably going to be more likely to put more effort into doing well on an IQ test. Or maybe your English ability, right? If English is not your first language and you're taking an English IQ test, you're probably not going to do as well as if you spoke proper English or you were taking an IQ test in your native language. Just because you can't speak English and you're taking an English test, that doesn't mean you're not smart, right? It just means you can't understand the test. If you took that test in, let's say, Spanish, and if Spanish was your native language, you would do better. So it's not a measure of your IQ, or these things influence your score that aren't related to intelligence. So think about things like situational factors. Temperature, right? If the temperature in the room is super hot, you're probably not going to do as well or score as high on an IQ test as if the temperature is good, right? Or whatever your preferred temperature is. Or think about things like distractions. So if you have a bunch of kids running around, or if a fire alarm goes off in the middle of your test, you're probably not going to do as well. And that's not a reflection of your IQ. It's just a reflection of situational factors. And there may be problems with the scale, right? With the IQ test. Perhaps there's questions that just aren't clear. Or maybe there's culturally specific questions. So this is actually a real problem with like the SAT scores, right? They may be culturally specific questions. So here are 4 different types of ways that your IQ test can be affected that isn't related to your intelligence. So hopefully you can see why this would be a problem, right? If we have a measure of IQ, you're doing a psychological study, and you have this measure of IQ, you want to try to limit or reduce as many of these factors as possible because you want that true IQ score. You don't want all this other crap affecting your score. So our goal is to minimize measurement error. But there's a problem. We don't know exactly what the true score is. So think about something like self-esteem, or I mean, you can even stick with IQ. How do you know what is your true IQ score? Well, we're not really sure, right? What's your true self-esteem score? We don't know, right? You can't, these are just these constructs that we as psychologists, researchers have come up with. Now we can use measures to assess that, and we can assume that these measures are good, right? Like, because a bunch of groups are using self-esteem as their validated measure. We're assuming that those self-esteem measures are actually measuring self-esteem. And how do we know that? Well, we can look at things like reliability and validity. So let's jump into what reliability and validity are. Remember, these are big picture things about reliability and validity. There's only a couple slides on them. Watch that mini lecture because it will go into a little bit more detail. So reliability is how consistent a measure is. So let's say we have a scale, right, that measures your weight. Like you're in your bathroom, you have a scale that measures your weight. And I go and step on it, and it says 150 pounds. Then I get off and I step back on it, and it says 155 pounds. I get off, I get back on it 5 seconds later, and it says 104 pounds. Is that consistent? No, right? It's not consistent. It gives you a different answer every single time. So this is a problem with consistency, which would then equate to a problem in reliability. So think about something that a construct, a psychological construct that shouldn't change from minute to minute. Depression, right? Depression is something that is pretty stable across weeks. If I were to give you a depression scale, let's say right now, and you get a score, I'm going to give you an arbitrary score of 30, whatever that means, whatever. And then I were to give you that same depression scale 5 minutes from now, in theory, because depression is relatively stable, you should score a 30, a 29, a 31, somewhere around a 30. Now, if I were to give you that depression scale, right, 5 minutes later, and it would say a 15, that's probably not assessing depression because depression should be stable. So if your measure is unreliable, then what you're most likely measuring is this error variance, or scroll back, or your measure is picking up some of these things, and it's not a reliable measure. Once again, watch that mini lecture. She'll talk more about how we measure reliability. All right, let's switch to validity. So this is the extent to which a measurement reflects the construct we're actually intending to measure. So is our measure of self-esteem actually measuring self-esteem? Is our measure of depression actually measuring depression? How do we assess validity? At a surface level, we can use things like face validity and construct validity. So face validity is essentially, on the surface, if you're looking at a scale, does it look like it assesses what we're trying to assess? Like, do our questions assess depression? But you got to be aware about this because face validity, you can't always go by face validity. And here's an example. Hold up your hand and like you can click your fingers together like this, right? And now if I were to give you a pattern of, click your thumb to your pinky, then your ring, then your middle, then your pointer, and do it in a pattern, and I gave you a pattern, how fast you can do that pattern actually is a good indicator of how depressed you are. People who are depressed, people who are highly depressed actually do that relatively slow compared to people who are not as depressed. But if I were to tell you that, and that is real, that is true. But if I were to tell you that, you would probably, Seneca had that face of like, what, really? You would probably be like, that on the surface, that does not assess depression. That is not a good measure of depression. How about holding your breath? If I were to assess how long you hold your breath, in our lab, we actually use that as a measure of how much of distress tolerance. So how much you can actually tolerate being distressed. And it correlates relatively well with other measures of distress tolerance. On the surface level, probably doesn't look like it, but it does. So you need to take face validity at, for lack of better words, face value, and know that some things that don't look like they actually assess depression do, or whatever construct. But for the most part, like if you're doing a self-esteem scale, the questions should probably look like they assess self-esteem. You wouldn't want questions looking like, if you're assessing self-esteem, how fast do you brush your teeth? That probably doesn't assess self-esteem, right? So construct validity is this knowing that this measure reflects hypothetical constructs, and you can do this in several different ways. Once again, watch that video, it will tell you more. One way, just very fast, is let's say we know we have a validated measure of depression, and we are going to create another measure of depression. Well, if you assess both of them, the scales should correlate, or they should be very similar, right? If both are assessing depression, both of our scales should be very similar when we look at the data. Anyways, watch that video, you'll hear more. So remember, reliability equals the consistency of a measure, while validity is how real the measure is, or is the measure actually assessing what we want it to measure? So here's a question for you. Put the answer in the chat. I decide to assess intelligence using a tape measure. The larger the circumference of a person's head, the more intelligent I declare them to be. Is my measure both reliable and valid? Is it reliable but not valid? Is it valid but not reliable? Or is it neither valid nor reliable? All right, I'm seeing it seems to be split between two different options, but majority of people said B. It is reliable, but not valid. And that is the correct answer. And let me explain why. And other people said D. It's neither valid nor reliable. So it's definitely not valid, right? The circumference of your head does not matter at all for intelligence. However, it is reliable because you're using a tape measure. And every time you measure my head, right, it should, assuming you're reading the tape measure right, it should say the same thing every single time. So it is reliable, it is consistent, but it's not actually measuring intelligence, therefore it's not valid. Can I get a thumbs up understanding why it's reliable but it's not valid? Does that make sense? All right, good. I'm seeing a bunch of thumbs up. I think 2 more slides. So a measurement can be reliable but not valid, like we just experienced. So here's another example. Imagine that you get stopped after a night of drinking with your friends and you're only 20 years old. When a cop asks, have you been drinking? Do you say yes or no? A rhetorical question, but probably pretty reliable that you're going to say no, right? No, officer, I haven't been drinking. Is that a valid measure of whether you've been drinking or not? No, it's not. It's a valid measure of I don't want to get in trouble, right? So it's reliable. You're most likely always going to say, no, officer, I haven't been drinking, but it's not valid. However, a measurement cannot be valid but unreliable. If a measure is unreliable, you're tapping into measurement error, not necessarily what you're intending to measure. So if a measure is valid, it always has to be unreliable. It always has to be reliable, excuse me. But a measure can be reliable but not valid. All right, one final slide, and then I have a couple things to say, so we might go like a minute over, but please stick with me. So final thoughts, your study is only as good as your measures, right? Hopefully this is an idea that has been coming up multiple times for the past week and a half, 2 weeks. No measure is perfect, but selecting an effective and good measure is critical to research design. Once again, read the literature. So effective validated measures exist to measure many important psychological constructs, right? We have a bunch of different measures to measure almost everything. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. If you're designing a study, now for the purposes of our group study, I am having you come up with questions to assess exercise or to assess social media use. But in a real world study, you don't have to come up with your own questions every single time. I'm just going to use another scale that's been validated, because actually validating a scale, it takes a long time and there's a lot of processes. Going back to that one slide where you have, it's like write, revise, and like test or something like that. This is a big process, scale development in real psychological research. This can take like years. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel if you don't need to. And then consider multiple measures. So some of the best studies use multiple measurement techniques to yield this idea of converging evidence. Or if I wanted to measure, I don't know, if I wanted to measure smoking, right? I could ask people, I should use multiple different ways to measure smoking to make sure I'm tapping into everything and that they're all reliable. So I could do a self-report of asking participants how often they smoke. Then I could also do pause. Let's say I was doing a smoking cessation study. So I wanted to see what if I could get people to stop smoking. I could ask people how many cigarettes they're smoking and see over the course of a week after incorporating some program if they're reducing how much they smoke. I could also do physiological tests and test the nicotine the nicotine levels in their body to see, okay, are they actually decreasing smoking? And maybe I could do, if I was a super sleuth, I could do an observation and I could stalk these participants and see if they're smoking or not. Probably a little bit unrealistic, but I do know even in a psych department, like Melissa Blank does research on smoking cessation, and they do take physiological samples as well as ask participants. So there's multiple different ways to assess it to make sure you're truly getting at the real answer. All right, so don't go just yet. So that is all of the material. Let me look at the syllabus. That is all of the material for exam number 1. We have covered everything. Let me go ahead and stop recording.